Hi guys. So we just left off. The two boys ran into McScott in the cave, and he ends up just telling them the whole story about how when he was young, he was the one who actually shot Martin Johansson on accident. So we're kind of just going from there. Chapter 29. It was an accident, Early said a second time, only this time I realized he was right. It had been an accident. But how had he known? "Why did you put him in a cave?" asked Early. "His mother has been waiting for him to come home. She has supper ready." McScott lowered his gun slightly, the weight of it taking its toll. "I put him in the cave to keep animals away while I went to tell Mrs. Johansson. She'd been my teacher in the 8th grade and had always been good to me. But then I got near the house and saw her calling out for him, searching those woods. She said she expected him home any minute, and I lost all courage. I left and never went back." "You could still tell her," Early said in his way that made everything sound so simple. "You could still make things right." The Winchester sagged a little more. I looked at Early, amazed. Could he actually persuade McScott to tell the old woman? "That's an admirable suggestion," he said, the gun and his decision seeming to teeter in the balance. McScott thought a moment, maybe actually considering the possibility, but then made up his mind, again. He took a partially smoked cigarette from his jacket pocket. Still cradling the rifle in one hand, he ran a match against his pant leg with the other, and lit the cigarette stub in one quick motion. "No, I'm already too far down this road. There's no turning back. Mrs. Johansson's an old woman who's better off waiting for her son to come home than knowing he's dead. And I'll spend the rest of my days hunting down every bear, coon, and 8-point buck from here to Canada, starting with the great Appalachian bear you two have been tracking. He'll bring in a fine bounty." So that was what he'd been doing all this time, making up for one missed shot on a bullseye by racking up every hunting trophy and bounty in Maine. He was trying to prove to everyone that he could hit his mark. But looking at McScott's gaunt face and one sunken eye, I could tell that wasn't all. It wasn't just the missed shot at the bullseye that he'd been carrying around for 50-some years. It was the shot he'd made and hadn't meant to that had eaten him up from the inside out. He puffed the last of his cigarette, letting it drop to the ground and smashing it under the toe of his boot. "Hey," said Early, his eyes wide, "you told a lie earlier. You said you never went back to Mrs. Johansson's house. But you have too been there." I expected McScott to deny it and wondered what a back-and-forth argument between Early and McScott would look like. But McScott said nothing. He just shifted his weight from one leg to the other. "You're the one who's been cutting Mrs. Johansson's firewood. When I went to get the shovel, the wood was stacked up under the overhang of the shed, and there were cigarette stubs lying all around. They were lucky strikes, just like the ones Mr. Wallace, the custodian at school, smokes. Only yours are all burned down to the quick and smashed flat, like that one there." I shifted my gaze from Early back to McScott, still waiting for his rebuttal. He remained silent. "So you know then," said Early. McScott refused to answer. "Know what?" I asked, unable to continue being a spectator in this bizarre showdown. One of them had a gun, but the other had words that were apparently hitting their mark. I'd seen everything Early had just mentioned at Mrs. Johansson's house, the same cut wood and cigarette stubs. It hadn't meant anything to me. Could Early be right? Had McScott been sort of a caretaker for Mrs. Johansson, cutting her firewood, maybe even bringing her food, a box of tea, an occasional chicken, a jar of blueberry jam? "What does he know?" I asked again. "He's seen Mrs. Johansson," Early said. "He knows that she's ready to let go, but she can't, not until Martin comes home." "Well now," McScott broke his silence, his voice a little more gravelly than before. "That's been the problem all along, hasn't it? Her son ain't coming home." He gave the telltale cigarette butt a nudge with his boot. "That was a long time ago, and there's nothing left that can be put right." Maybe it was the way McScott stared so intently with such regret at Martin Johansson just then, but I had a thought. I reached down and lifted Early's jacket. Then, searching through Martin's other jacket pocket, I pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Early recognized it for what it was before I did. "Hey, it's that old bullseye." He unfurled it and held it out to McScott. I thought that was like waving a red flag in front of a raging bull. "There's only one hole, so you're right. You missed it altogether." McScott started to squeeze his finger on the Winchester trigger. What he means is, I said, trying to come up with something else that Early might have meant, something other than, you're a lousy shot and here's the bullseye to prove it. We had to get out of that cave if we didn't each want to end up in another pile of bones. And Early's pointing out McScott's miserable failure to hit that bullseye was surely not going to help us. I mean, what Early is trying to say is... I grasped for words. McScott was obviously reliving the whole story as if it were happening all over again. How many times had he replayed that day in his mind? How many times has he wished he could have one more chance at that bullseye? Actually, that was an idea. I stood up a little straighter. What Early is suggesting is that it's a very small bullseye. Maybe you could hit it if you just had another chance. I mean, you probably still wouldn't hit the actual bullseye, but you might at least hit the paper. The Dread Pirate's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I could hit that bullseye dead center 5 times in a row if I wanted to. From in here, sure, it's a tiny little cave. McScott sneered. You think I'm stupid, don't you? You don't want me to kill you right here in this cave. You want me to take you outside to prove I can hit this bullseye, so that you'll have a better chance of getting away. Is that right? I didn't answer. Is that right, Jackie? Early asked. Pretty much, I grumbled. That's a good idea. I like that idea, said Early. Do you like that idea, Mr. McScott? A challenge, he mused. Marksmanship and a hunt all in one. He seemed to warm to the idea. All right, why don't we go outside, get ourselves some fresh air? I'll take 4 shots at the bullseye and still have 2 bullets left. McScott walked behind us, gun at our backs, as we headed out under the waterfall. I nearly lost my balance on the slippery rocks, but Early and I made it to the bank only slightly damp from our efforts. There's a good sycamore tree about 40 paces off. Tack it up there and you can make your move. Early and I headed for the tree. Once we were out of the earshot, Early asked the worst question he could possibly ask. Which direction should we go in? Our lives depended on the answer to that question, and the obvious answer was in the opposite direction of McScott and his gun. Early smoothed the paper's bullseye and reached to attach it to the tree, stabbing it through with my pocket knife. He paused, looking at me expectantly. I glanced around in panic. The first shot was fired, the bullet hitting in the center of the bullseye, right between Early and me. Let's go that way, I yelled, as Early and I ran in the opposite direction of McScott. We started off as the day turned to dusk, and as McScott raised his gun and took his second shot. There was no right or wrong way to go. We simply tried to run away fast. Still, you can't just run around like a chicken with his head cut off. I'd seen a chicken with his head cut off, and it didn't get very far. Within seconds, we heard 2 more shots, one after another. The sound echoed in the woods, but Early and I had plotted our course, and we stuck with it, tacking this way and that, heading in what we thought was a northerly direction. It would have been a good course, too, a kind of grand steeplechase that consisted of jumping through bogs filled with wet, rotting leaves, dodging low-hanging branches, crawling under a fallen tree, and scaling a treacherous and rocky slope. But that last part landed us in trouble. We'd been running hard, our heavy breathing seeming to echo all around us, when I realized we'd run into a steep and rocky incline. Turning back, we heard a loud thrashing of sound not far behind us. We'd had the advantage of youth and with it speed, but McScott had the greater advantage, experience in these woods. It dawned on me then that he'd pointed us toward the sycamore tree for a reason. He knew these woods better than anybody and knew how to steer us into a trap. Now it was too late. We'll have to climb it. I knew it wouldn't be a problem for Early. He'd proven himself to be a nimble climber back at Gunner's place. And sure enough, he clambered and reached the top before I'd gotten halfway there. I stuck my feet carefully here and there, struggling for footing, while dirt and rocks skittered down the slope. I grabbed for any root, branch, or handhold I could find. Panting and perspiring, I reached for a sturdy-looking tree root jutting out from the rock wall. If I can just get a good hold there and then hoist myself the rest of the way. I reached into the open space beneath the exposed root when I saw a wet clump of leaves move. Before I could react, a snake clamped down on my hand, and I fell down, 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 landing with a thud on my back at the bottom of the rocky incline. So that was chapter 29, kind of a cliffhanger. We'll pick up with chapter 30 next time. See you guys later.